They say that if you truly wish to feel the heartbeat of the Middle Ages, you must go not to the castle on the hill, nor to the cathedral that towers above the town, but to the village market. For the market was the soul of the medieval world, the place where lives intersected, where stories unfolded, and where the quiet rhythms of everyday survival revealed themselves in the clatter of trade and the hum of human voices. Imagine, then, that you are standing at the edge of a medieval village, just as the first light of dawn stretches across the fields. The air is cool and damp, scented with the sharp freshness of dew that lingers on grass and hedges. A faint mist curls low over the earth, turning the world soft and dreamlike. The village itself is still half asleep, smoke curls lazily from a few chimneys, dogs stretch and yawn in doorways, and shutters creak open as early risers peer into the pale light. But at the heart of this village, something stirs. The square, an open patch of earth framed by timber-framed houses and the shadow of a small stone church awaits transformation. Yesterday it was only an empty expanse where children played and elders lingered in conversation. Today, it will become something else entirely. For today is market day, and market day is unlike any other. The first to arrive are the farmers. Long before the sun has risen, they guide their wooden carts into the square, the wheels groaning against ruts in the road. Donkeys huff in the chill air, their breath steaming as they pull loads of produce, hay, and tools. One farmer climbs down stiffly from his seat and begins to untie a bundle of onions, their papery skins whispering as he spreads them across a rough wooden table. Another tips over a basket, and apples roll gently across the boards, some green and tart, others glowing red with the fullness of autumn. A third unfurls bundles of herbs, sage, rosemary, thyme, until the air carries hints of green, sharp fragrance mingling with the damp morning earth. Slowly, stall by stall, the market awakens. A shepherd arrives, leading a small flock of sheep with bells that tinkle softly in the fog. He drives them into a makeshift pen of wooden stakes, where they cluster together, their fleece damp with dew. Nearby, a tinker drops his heavy pack, metal clinking as he unpacks iron pots, gleaming ladles, and sharp knives. With a practiced motion, he draws one blade against a whetstone, and a faint rasp carries through the square. Sparks flicker briefly, vanishing into the mist like fireflies. Then comes the baker. He emerges from the warmth of his oven, his arms wrapped around a wide basket filled with loaves so fresh that steam still curls from their crusts. The fragrance of bread, a fragrance rich, comforting, and irresistible, pushes back the fog itself. There are round loaves with cracked tops, brown loaves flecked with oats, and small rolls dusted with flour. He sets them out, and almost immediately, a few early customers appear, peasants who have risen before dawn to purchase food before beginning their long day in the fields. They clutch tiny purses of coins, eager to buy bread while it is still hot enough to warm their hands. Above all this, the church bell chimes. Once, then again. Its sound drifts across the square, deep and resonant, as though blessing the day with its solemn music. And with that, the market day has officially begun. The empty square is no longer empty. Stalls stretch open their canvas awnings, fabric fluttering as ropes are tugged into place. Wooden signs creak above booths, painted with the marks of their trade, a shoe, a tankard, a bolt of cloth. Chickens flutter nervously in wicker cages, their wings rustling as children peek inside. A brewer rolls small barrels into place, the wood dark with dampness, promising ale rich and foamy. A cloth merchant unfurls lengths of wool dyed in colors that shine like jewels in the weak morning light, deep indigo, russet red, and forest green. Around the edges of the square, townsfolk begin to gather. Some come to trade, others to talk, and some simply to watch. The hum of voices grows, a gentle murmur rising like the tide. A dog barks and chases a chicken that escapes its cage, sending children squealing with laughter. A man with a lute tunes his strings, testing the notes that will soon become music to fill the air. Everywhere you look, life is stirring. The medieval village market is more than a place of commerce, it is the very stage upon which the drama of daily life unfolds. Here, neighbors greet each other after long weeks apart. Here, strangers arrive with strange goods from distant places, carrying with them whispers of other lands and other lives. Here, fortunes may be made or lost, bargains struck, rivalries born, friendships renewed. And yet, for all its energy, the market is not rushed. Time feels different here. The day stretches long, unhurried, and the rhythms of life flow like the gentle pull of a river. The voices rise and fall, the clatter of trade mingles with laughter and gossip, and the smells of bread, herbs, wool, livestock blend into an aroma uniquely alive. This is the dawn of market day, the beginning of a journey that will carry us from early morning through bustling noon, into the long golden hours of afternoon, and finally into the quiet dusk when the square falls silent again. And as we walk slowly through this day, we will come to know not only the trades and the stalls, but the lives, dreams, and simple wonders of those who gather here. So breathe deeply, let the sounds of the market drift into your mind, and step with me now into the square. For this is where we will find the story of life in a medieval village market, a story written not in books or chronicles, but in the quiet, the bustling morning crowd. The sun had only just lifted itself higher into the pale blue sky, yet already the village square was alive with motion and murmur, as if 1,000 voices had been carried on the morning breeze. The stillness of dawn had given way to a gentle hum of activity, swelling slowly into something fuller, like a song that builds verse by verse until it fills the air completely. The cobblestones that had glistened with dew only an hour earlier and were now beaten by countless footsteps, boots, sandals, clogs, and bare feet alike, each carrying its own rhythm, yet somehow blending into a single steady pulse that seemed to beat in time with the life of the market. From every direction, villagers and travelers streamed toward the square. Narrow dirt paths that wound between fields, cottages, and woodlands had become temporary rivers of people, carrying men and women, children and elders, even dogs and goats, all converging on this one communal space. It was as though the heart of the village had been hidden in slumber, and the market was the moment it awoke, calling every soul back into its embrace. A farmer, his broad shoulders darkened from years beneath the sun, arrived with a cart laden high with sacks of grain. The wooden wheels creaked and protested, wobbling over uneven stones, yet he kept moving forward with a patience born of habit. Beside him, a boy, no more than 10, walked with a stick in hand, guiding a small flock of geese. The birds hissed and flapped their wings, annoyed by the press of bodies, yet they moved obediently toward the pens that awaited them near the square's edge. Each honk mingled with the chatter of human voices, adding its own peculiar note to the morning symphony. There were merchants too, far more colorful than the simple farmers. Some had come from nearby towns, their carts painted with symbols or lined with bright fabrics that fluttered with each breeze. Others had traveled great distances, their clothes marking them as outsiders, their accents carrying the cadence of other lands. One man wore a long cloak stitched with foreign patterns, his cart heavy with clay pots that bore unfamiliar design spirals and waves that no local villager could claim as their own. A woman followed behind, her stalls stacked with bolts of dyed cloth so vibrant that they seemed to hold sunlight in their threads. Reds that glowed like embers, blues deep as twilight, yellows soft as buttercups, each piece promised a fragment of the faraway world to those who lived their lives bound to this little village. At first, the crowd was gentle, still able to move with ease through open spaces. But as the minutes passed, the square thickened with bodies, the hum of voices rising into a great chorus. Conversations blended together into a language of their own, half laughter, half argument, half greeting, all folded into one. It was not harsh or overwhelming, but constant, like the sound of a river rushing past rocks. A smith leaned against his cart, his arms blackened with soot, calling out in a booming voice to announce his tools, knives and hooks, hinges and locks, all gleaming in the early light. His cry was answered by the soft, melodic singing of a dairymaid, who coaxed passers-by toward her baskets of cheese. The rich, earthy smell of ripened wheels mixed with the sharper scent of onions from a nearby stall, while further still the sweetness of honey mingled with the warm spice of roasted nuts. The air itself seemed crowded, as though every scent, Every sound, every brush of fabric against fabric had layered itself into an invisible tapestry above the square. One could close their eyes and know they were in a market by smell alone: hay and manure from the penned animals, herbs crushed underfoot, leather stretched and oiled, smoke drifting from a cook's fire where strips of meat sizzled. And yet, somehow, nothing clashed. The variety of aromas, much like the variety of people, found a way to live together in harmony, forming an atmosphere that was uniquely its own. Children wove themselves between the legs of grown men and women, darting here and there with energy that seemed endless. Some played games, tossing little pebbles in a circle scratched onto the stones, while others carried baskets half their size, helping parents by fetching small bundles or holding onto ropes that tethered goats. Their laughter carried above the drone of adult voices, sharp and clear, like bells ringing in a far-off tower. A little girl clutched a carved wooden doll, her father having bargained for it earlier, and she spun it happily in the air as though it were flying. Another child stood near a baker's stall, eyes wide with longing as the smell of fresh bread wafted from the warm loaves piled high. The baker noticed, smiled, and with a kindness that cost him little, handed the boy a small crust torn from the end of a loaf. The boy's grin was brighter than any coin could have bought. In one corner of the square, an entertainer had drawn a small crowd. His clothes were patched in a dozen colors, his face painted with streaks of chalky white, his lips quick to curl into a grin. With deft fingers, he balanced knives, tossing them into the air with a flourish that made the crowd gasp in unison. Then he bowed deeply, sweeping his cap before them, and coins clinked into the fabric. Behind him, a fiddler had begun to play, the bow scraping against strings in a tune that was quick and lively. The music added yet another layer to the morning, pulling smiles onto weary faces and coaxing feet to tap along. Even the geese, unsettled by the crowd, seemed momentarily soothed by the fiddler melody. Yet, not all was played. Business, as always, was at the heart of the market. Farmers haggled with merchants, wives with butchers, travelers with innkeepers. The language of trade was a performance of its own, voices rising and falling in mock protest, hands gesturing wildly, faces frowning one moment and breaking into laughter the next. A woman with a basket of eggs pressed for a higher price, her brow furrowed, her words sharp. The buyer, a tavern keeper, shook his head dramatically, clutching his purse as though she were robbing him. Around them, onlookers smiled knowingly, for they had seen the same dance 1,000 times before. And, as always, after much grumbling, a compromise was reached, and both walked away convinced they had won. Amidst it all, the church bell rang in the distance, its heavy voice rolling over the rooftops. It was a reminder of time, of order, of the greater rhythm in which this daily bustle was set. For a brief moment, the crowd seemed to pause, eyes lifting toward the spire. A few crossed themselves, murmuring quick prayers before returning to the clamor. For life in the market was not just about buying and selling, it was also about gathering, sharing news, meeting old friends, and catching glimpses of the wider world. Two villagers leaned against the well at the center of the square, their mugs of ale already half empty, though the day was still young. They exchanged gossip in low voices: who had married, who had quarreled, who had disappeared, who had returned. News from afar was more precious still. A merchant spoke of war in distant lands, of kings who quarreled and armies that marched. Another whispered of strange storms that had swallowed ships at sea. These stories, true or not, passed quickly from ear to ear, embroidered with each telling, until they seemed as much a part of the market as the bread and the cheese. As the sun climbed higher, the crowd grew thicker still, pressing shoulder against shoulder, elbow against elbow. Yet, there was no malice in the closeness. It was the intimacy of a shared life, the recognition that each person depended on the other, that a loaf of bread could not exist without the flour, nor the flour without the miller, nor the miller without the farmer. The market was not only a place of trade, it was the living thread that wove the community together, each exchange a stitch, each word a knot, binding people into the fabric of the village itself. And so, the morning wore on, a living tide of motion and sound, of color and scent, swelling within the square. To walk through it was to feel carried by a current, swept gently from one moment to the next. The crowd was not chaotic but the chorus, each voice, each stall, each hand extended in greeting or bargain a note in the larger song. And as the sun moved toward its zenith, casting sharper shadows and painting the square in gold, it seemed that this market, this gathering of souls, could go on forever, as timeless as the turning of the seasons themselves. The voices of the market. If the morning crowd had given the market its body, the movement, the colors, the sheer living pulse, then the voices gave it its soul. Without them, the square would have been a silent painting, vivid but lifeless. It was through words, laughter, bargaining cries, songs, and stories that the market became alive, breathing with the rhythm of human exchange. The soundscape was not random noise, it was layered like music, each note holding its own place, each voice carrying its own weight in the harmony of the day. At first, the listener might only notice the loudest cries, the merchants calling, the barkers advertising their goods, the performers announcing their acts. A butcher stood behind his heavy wooden stall, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his arms thick from years of cleaving bone. With a voice as sharp as his knife, he called out the quality of his meat, pork fresh from the morning's slaughter, beef marbled with fat, sausages coiled like ropes. Each word was punctuated with the dull thud of his cleaver striking wood, the sound echoing across the square like a drum. Not far from him, a fishmonger shouted in a voice raw from salt air, praising the freshness of his catch. He lifted glistening fish high into the light, their silver scales flashing like coins. "Caught at dawn," he cried, "the sea's own gift, brought straight to your table." His words carried the tang of the ocean, even here, far from the shore. People gathered around, some wrinkling their noses at the sharp scent, others leaning closer, drawn by the promise of food unlike any they could catch themselves. And yet, beyond these strong calls, there were softer voices, subtler but no less essential. The dairymaid, her voice lilting and sweet, coaxed customers not with shouts but with songs. She spoke in gentle rhymes, half rhyme and half melody, weaving the qualities of her cheeses into verses that felt more like lullabies than sales pitches. Children gathered at her stall simply to hear her sing, their parents soon following, lured by both the song and the creamy rounds wrapped in cloth. Everywhere one turned, voices layered over voices. Haggling rose and fell like waves, starting in whispers, swelling into sharp protests, then breaking back into laughter and compromise. "Too much, far too much," cried a woman with a kerchief tied beneath her chin, shaking her head at a price for onions. "Then you'll find no better," replied the merchant, arms crossed, though the smile tugging at his lips betrayed him. Around them, neighbors chimed in with their own opinions, turning a single bargain into a miniature performance, part drama, part comedy, ending as it always did, with coin exchanging hands, with both sides believing they had won. There were storytellers too, voices not tied to goods but to imagination. One old man with a beard as wild as tangled straw perched himself upon a low stool, his cane across his knees. With a practiced tone, he began to speak not of the price of bread or the weight of cheese, but of knights and dragons, saints and miracles, kingdoms lost and kingdoms found. Children crept closer, their eyes round as saucers, their mouths hanging open. Even grown men paused, their errands momentarily forgotten, drawn by the cadence of a tale that reached deeper than daily life. The storyteller's voice carried over the crowd, threading itself between other sounds like a hidden melody, timeless and enduring. In another corner, the jester's laughter rang out, shrill and contagious. His voice leapt from joke to jest, tumbling words faster than most could follow, but it hardly mattered. His audience laughed anyway, carried by his energy, their worries forgotten in the sound of shared amusement. Coins clinked into his hat as reward for the joy his voice alone could summon. But not all voices were meant for joy. There were stern tones too, voices heavy with authority. A tax collector moved through the square, his voice sharp and commanding as he called for dues. The clink of collected coins was different from the clink of trade, harder, colder, final. People listened with a mix of obedience and resentment, murmuring under their breath once he had passed. The market was freedom, but within it lingered reminders of order, of obligations owed to lords and kings. There were the quiet voices too, the murmurs often overlooked. Lovers whispered to each other as they browsed stalls hand in hand. Old women gossiping near the well, their words sharp and knowing. Pilgrims prayed softly as they passed the church steps. These softer tones threaded through the day like a subtle embroidery, unnoticed by some, but adding richness for those who listened closely. And then, rising above it all, was the sound of the bell again, deep, sonorous, carrying over rooftops and chimneys, cutting briefly through the patchwork of voices. The market paused, just for a heartbeat, as though the whole square inhaled together. Then, like a river breaking free of ice, the voices surged again, louder than before, emboldened by the interruption. It was not only human voices that sang in this great chorus. Animals had their part as well. Goats bleated, chickens clucked, donkeys brayed, dogs barked, and somewhere, a caged songbird trilled sweetly. These sounds did not clash with the human chorus but joined it, each one a reminder that the market was more than commerce, it was life in its full measure, human and animal alike, woven together in sound. If one stood in the center of the square, eyes closed, ears open, the market would reveal itself not as chaos but as harmony. Each voice, no matter how small, added its own note to the living music of the day. The butcher's thunder, the dairymaid's melody, the haggler's sharp protests, the storyteller's steady rhythm, the jester's shrill laughter, the tacksman's command, the whisper of lovers, the gossip of crones, all layered together, rising and falling in an eternal song of community. For it was in these voices that the market's true magic lived. Goods could be bought elsewhere, food could be grown at home, but here, in the square, one could hear the whole life of the village expressed through sound. To walk among the stalls was to be part of that music, whether speaking or silent, whether calling or listening. The voices of the market carried memory, carried tradition, carried the very essence of the village. And long after the day was done, long after the stalls were packed away and the square stood empty, it was the voices that lingered in the mind, echoing like a song that refuses to fade. The goods of distant lands. As the morning deepened and the market found its steady rhythm, a particular fascination began to draw the eyes of villagers and travelers alike. The stalls and carts that bore goods from beyond the horizon, treasures and curiosities carried across hills, rivers, forests, and sometimes even the sea itself. These were not the everyday wares of bread and cheese, not the familiar cabbages and onions from the village gardens, but objects that seemed to hum with the mystery of faraway places, reminders that though the village was small, the world was vast, and its wonders could, for a moment, be gathered here in this very square. The first of these merchants was easy to spot, for his cart seemed to glow like a chest of jewels. Richly dyed fabrics hung from its wooden frame, catching the sunlight in bold displays of crimson, azure, emerald, and gold. The villagers, who dressed daily in homespun wool of earthy browns and grays, approached as though drawn by firelight. Their hands hovered above the cloth, afraid to touch, and yet unable to resist the temptation. One bolt shimmered with a hue of deep indigo, the kind of color that seemed to drink in light and hold its secret within its folds. Another cloth bore embroidered patterns of curling vines and birds in flight, worked with such detail that one might imagine the tiny feathers rustling in the breeze. The merchant's voice carried with pride as he explained, "This blue comes from distant lands where the flowers themselves bleed color into the fabric. And this golden thread? Spun fine as spider's silk, woven by hands that have never seen snow." His words painted pictures of places the villagers could scarcely imagine, warm climates where the sun lingered year-round, seas that stretched endlessly beyond sight, cities where stone towers rose higher than church spires. To touch the fabric was to brush against another world, to feel for a moment the closeness of distant kingdoms. Not far from the fabric stall, another merchant had arranged jars of spices, their stoppers sealed tight to preserve what they held. Yet even with the lids closed, the air around the stall was rich with scent so thick and layered that it seemed to bend time and place. Villagers leaned in, sniffing curiously, their brows furrowing at aromas they could not name. Some jars contained powders the color of fire, reds and oranges so bright they seemed to burn the eyes. Others held tiny seeds, dull in appearance but bursting with hidden flavors. And in the center of the display stood a small box, opened with ceremony, revealing sticks of cinnamon, curled like scrolls of ancient writing. "This," said the spice seller, "comes from trees that grow where the air is heavy with heat, where the soil itself breathes fire. A pinch in your bread, and it becomes a feast. A drop in your ale, and it warms the heart even in winter's cold." His words carried promise, but it was the scents themselves that captivated. The villagers closed their eyes, inhaling deeply, and for a moment they stood not in a cobbled square but in lands they would never see, tasting suns they would never feel. Elsewhere, a table gleamed with objects carved from ivory and bone, polished until they reflected the light like smooth river stones. Figurines of animals sat lined in rows, lions crouched in eternal watchfulness, elephants with tusks arched high, birds frozen mid-flight. Each piece was small enough to fit in the palm, yet so detailed that the very texture of fur or feather seemed to whisper beneath the fingertips. The craftsman, his hair streaked with gray, spoke little, letting the work itself speak in silence. Those who held the carvings felt something more than admiration. They felt wonder that such creatures might exist in lands far from their own, and that through these figures, those distant lives could rest for a time in their hands. At another stall, brass instruments caught the light, horns and bells and small cymbals that rang with bright, piercing tones when struck. A boy tapped one with a stick, and the sound shot into the air like a spark, startling a flock of pigeons into flight. Laughter followed, but the merchant only smiled, nodding proudly at the music his wares carried. "Each sound is a gift," he said. "A way to call across distance, a way to mark the hours, a way to make the air itself dance." For those whose days were marked only by the toll of the church bell, the idea of filling the square with other songs was enchanting. But perhaps most mysterious were the objects with no clear use, curiosities that seemed to belong to another age. One stall displayed small glass beads, smooth and round, in colors so deep they looked alive. The merchant explained they were melted from sands found only near the sea, shaped by heat so great that it could turn stone to liquid. A woman picked one up and held it to her eye, marveling at how the world blurred and bent through its curve. Another merchant laid out seashells. Strange in their spirals, their edges sharp as knives. Some villagers had never seen the sea. To them, the shells were treasures equal to any jewel, proof of places that might as well have been as far away as the stars. Children gathered most eagerly around the stall of a traveler who sold tales as much as trinkets. His table held coins stamped with faces of kings no villager could name, feathers longer than a man's arm, and a tiny box that rattled with something hidden within. For every question asked, he gave a story, of deserts that stretched endless and golden, of ships that sailed for months without sight of land, of mountains so high their tops pierced the clouds. Each object was more than itself, it was a doorway, a hint of the vastness beyond the square. Of course, not everyone could afford such luxuries. A bolt of fabric dyed in indigo costs more than a farmer might earn in a season. A pouch of spices, more than a family could spare. But even so, the villagers came, if only to look, if only to breathe in the strangeness of the world carried to them on wagons and ships. To see was to know, and to know was its own kind of wealth. The merchants understood this, and so they displayed their treasures openly, allowing even the poorest child to marvel at things he would never own. The voices of bargaining rose here too, but softer, more hesitant. To haggle over onions was one thing, to haggle over silk or spice another. The villagers lowered their voices, their eyes glancing over their shoulders, as though afraid the distant lands themselves might overhear their attempts to lower the price. The merchants, practiced in this dance, smiled knowingly, letting coins slip from purses one by one, until the treasures changed hands. And always, there was the sense of wonder, the feeling that within the square, the world itself had been gathered. The cobblestones bore the weight of goats and chickens, but also of fabrics dyed under foreign suns, spices grown in faraway soil, shells shaped by distant tides. The villagers might never leave their fields, their cottages, their familiar woods, but here, in the market, they touched the edges of the great unknown. The sun climbed higher, and the colors of the goods grew brighter. The fabrics shone like flames, the glass beads sparkled like captured stars, the spices glowed like embers. The air itself seemed to carry more than the sense of bread and smoke. It carried mystery, possibility, a promise that the world was larger than any one village square. And so, as the crowd pressed closer to these stalls, eyes wide, hands reaching, voices murmuring in awe, the market transformed again. No longer merely a place of necessity, no longer simply a gathering of neighbors, it became a window into the vastness of human life. A reminder that beyond the thatched roofs and plowed fields lay a world without end, waiting in colors, in scents, in stories, in treasures brought from distant lands. The rhythm of noon. The bells of the church tower rang once, twice, and then fell still, marking the slow arrival of the midday hour. By now, the sun had climbed high above the thatched rooftops, warming the stones of the market square until they seemed to shimmer with heat. Shadows shortened, drawing tight beneath the feet of stalls and carts, and the air itself grew thick, heavy with the mingled scents of food, livestock, and the distant smoke of cottage hearths. It was here, in this moment suspended between morning bustle and afternoon calm, that the rhythm of noon took hold, a rhythm as steady as the turning of the seasons, one that shaped the flow of every market day. The frenzied energy of early trading had softened into something slower, more measured. The shouts of hawkers grew fewer, replaced by the steady hum of voices woven together like a low chant. Even the animals seemed to quiet, their bleats and clucks falling into a gentler cadence, as if the entire square were breathing in unison. The villagers, too, moved differently now. Those who had rushed in the early hours to claim the best produce or secure a cut of meat now lingered, baskets already half full, hands moving less urgently. Some paused to rest upon the steps of the fountain, its trickling water catching the light, offering a brief coolness in the midday sun. Children splashed their fingers in the stream, their laughter subdued compared to the shrill squeals of morning play. Mothers called them back, but even their voices carried less edge, softened by the heaviness of noon. Stalls selling food and drink now found themselves at the heart of the square's attention. Bakers who had risen before dawn to pull loaves from ovens now displayed what remained, bread crusted golden, rolls fragrant with herbs, and pies whose buttery scent carried on the breeze. Beside them, women ladled steaming broth into wooden bowls, each portion rich with vegetables, beans, and scraps of salted meat. Laborers hunched nearby, spoons clutched tight, slurping with gratitude, their hunger sharpened by hours of lifting, carrying, and bartering. Ale flowed too, darker and warmer than the morning air. Jugs passed from hand to hand, shared among neighbors and strangers alike, loosening tongues and setting stories free. Men leaned against the rough beams of stalls, laughing as they retold old tales, while women gathered in quiet knots, whispering news and secrets. Even here, amid the drinking and chatter, the rhythm of noon pressed gently, slowing movements, softening laughter into something drowsier, dreamlike. The sound of music began to rise from one corner of the square. A fiddler, his bow gliding easily across strings, coaxed a melody that danced lightly above the low hum of voices. Children swayed to its rhythm, their feet tapping on the cobblestones, while older villagers nodded in time, smiling faintly as memories stirred. Beside him, a piper added his tune, high and bright, weaving with the fiddle in playful counterpoint. Though no formal dancing began, the air itself seemed to move with the music, filling the spaces between stalls with an invisible thread of joy. Merchants, too, eased into this midday lull. The spice seller leaned back upon his cart, the rich aroma of cinnamon and cloves wafting lazily in the heat, drawing passers-by even when he spoke no word. The fabric merchant, whose voice had rung loud with persuasion in the morning, now sat upon a stool, fanning himself with a scrap of cloth, letting the colors of his wares speak silently in the sunlight. The blacksmith, sweat shining upon his brow, paused from his hammering to drink deeply from a jug of ale, the iron cooling beside him, as though even the tools themselves acknowledged the weight of noon. Livestock sellers gathered in quiet clusters, their animals tethered close, chewing cud or pawing at the ground. Deals that had seemed urgent in the morning could now wait until shadows lengthened again. Farmers leaned against their carts, hats shading their eyes, their conversations drifting lazily through the thick air. Some dozed where they stood, heads nodding briefly before snapping upright again, unwilling to lose themselves entirely to sleep while coins and trade still beckoned. In the center of the square, beneath the tall oak that had stood longer than any man alive, families gathered to share their midday meal. Cloths were spread upon the ground, baskets opened to reveal bread, cheese, apples, and jars of ale. Children gnawed crusts with eager mouths, while their parents ate slowly, savoring each bite. The oak's shade offered respite from the heat, its branches whispering softly in the still air, as though echoing the steady rhythm of the day. Yet amid this calm, business did not cease. Rather, it shifted shape. Where morning had demanded speed and shouting, noon invited patience and subtlety. Bargains struck now were quieter, built upon careful words and lingering glances. A farmer offered a wheel of cheese not with bluster but with quiet assurance, his eyes steady upon the buyer. A shepherd leaned close to whisper the health of a lamb, his voice soft enough that only the intended ear might hear. Trust mattered more at noon than noise, for in the heat and quiet, words carried farther, weighed heavier. Storytellers found their moment here as well. Beneath a stall's awning, one man drew a small circle of listeners with tales of saints and miracles, his voice rising and falling like the toll of a distant bell. Children leaned forward, wide-eyed, as he spoke of dragons vanquished and rivers parted, of travelers guided by stars and kingdoms built by fate. Coins clinked into his cap, but it was not money that held the listeners still. It was the story itself, unfolding slowly, in rhythm with the drowsy hour. And then there were the silent long, comfortable stretches where little was said at all. A woman sat upon the edge of her stall, hands folded in her lap, eyes watching the slow drift of clouds above. A man rested with his back against a cart, chewing thoughtfully upon a blade of grass, saying nothing, needing nothing. Even the market dogs, once lively and barking, now stretched in the shade, their sides rising and falling with steady breath. The market square itself seemed to sigh, the stones warm beneath countless feet, the air thick with a mingling of scents, bread, ale, livestock, spice, and sweat, all blending into something holy of the moment. Time slowed. The rhythm of noon was not one of urgency or clamor, but of pause, of waiting, of gathering strength for the hours yet to come. And yet beneath this quiet, life continued its patient weaving. A coin exchanged hands here, a loaf of bread there. A word of promise was given, a secret passed. The market's heartbeat, though slower, remained steady, carrying all who lingered within it toward the gentle unfolding of afternoon. For this was the rhythm of noon, a lull that was not an ending but a breath, a gathering of stillness before the will turned once more, before shadows lengthened, before voices rose again with the fading light. It was a time to rest, to listen, to feel the weight of the sun upon the shoulders and the coolness of shade upon the brow. A time to belong, to simply exist within the steady hum of the square, as though the world beyond the market could wait a little longer. And so, the villagers stayed eating, drinking, listening, resting. The merchants sat quietly, their goods shining in the sunlight, their voices softened but ready. The music played on, drifting like smoke through the air. And the market itself breathed in rhythm with the hour, steady and sure, carrying all within it toward the promise of afternoon. The afternoon trade winds. The sun had passed its peak, sliding ever so slowly westward, and with it, the market shifted once more into a new rhythm. Noon's heavy stillness began to lift, giving way to the soft stirrings of afternoon. A faint breeze stirred the air, threading gently through the market square, carrying with it the mingled scents of hay, smoke, and bread. It was a welcome relief, this wandering wind, as if nature itself had decided to lean close and exhale upon the weary village. The villagers felt it immediately. Heads lifted, shoulders straightened, and even the livestock seemed to stir with renewed energy. Chickens rustled their feathers, pigs grunted with livelier interest in the scraps thrown their way, and dogs lifted their noses to sniff the shifting air. The market, which only moments before had been resting in a quiet, drowsy lull, began to stretch its limbs, waking slowly as though from a nap. The afternoon trade had begun. Merchants leaned forward once more over their stalls, calling out with a fresh vigor. Their voices, softened at noon, now rose again, though not with the frantic edge of morning, but with a steadier, more deliberate confidence. They had gauged the day, measured the crowd, and now they pressed their advantage. Cloth sellers unfurled bolts of fabric so that the colors caught the sunlight, fluttering faintly in the wind like banners of distant kingdoms. The spice merchant lifted small wooden scoops, letting the powders fall in bright cascades, their aromas released afresh to tempt the air. Even the food sellers leaned into this moment. Roasting meat sizzled as juices dripped onto coals, sending up clouds of savory smoke that drifted across the square, drawing hungry eyes toward their stalls. Honey cakes were arranged neatly upon boards, their golden surfaces shining like coins in the light. Ale jugs were refilled, their frothy tops catching the sparkle of the sun, while ladles dipped again into cauldrons of stew that had been simmering steadily all morning. The trade of noon had been patient, but the trade of afternoon was purposeful, direct, certain. The breeze carried more than scents, it carried sounds too. Snatches of conversation drifted farther, the words of buyers and sellers weaving across the square, mingling like threads in a tapestry. Bargains were struck with louder voices now, firm handshakes sealing agreements as coins changed hands. There was laughter again, sharper and brighter than the soft chuckles of noon. Disputes too rose with the breeze, a farmer protesting the price of salt, a cloth buyer haggling over a bolt of wool, voices raised not in anger but in the age-old game of negotiation. Children once more found energy in this shifting air. They darted through the square, weaving between carts and animals, chasing each other with renewed shouts. Some carried small wooden toys purchased that morning, spinning tops that whirled upon the cobblestones, whistles that trilled sharply, carved animals pulled along by string. Their laughter cut through the deeper voices of the market, light and clear, like the singing of birds carried upon the trade winds. By now, visitors from nearby villages had arrived too. Some had left later in the morning, making their way along dusty roads, drawn by the promise of trade and gossip. They entered the square with wide eyes, their carts rattling behind them, their animals stamping nervously at the noise and smells. Greetings rose up to meet them, neighbors embracing, relatives clasping hands, merchants stepping forward to inspect their goods. These newcomers brought with them fresh produce, different accents, and the faint scent of fields and roads still clinging to their clothes. The arrival of outsiders gave the afternoon market its particular vibrancy. Their goods were compared against those already laid out in the square, their prices tested, their quality examined by practiced hands. Apples from one valley were weighed against pears from another. Cheese from one farm was tasted alongside the wheels of a rival. Even stories were traded, tales of weather, of harvests, of weddings and births in villages just beyond the horizon. The market square became a crossroads, where not only goods but lives intertwined. Artisans too found the afternoon to be their hour. The blacksmith returned to his hammer, the rhythmic clang ringing out once more, sharper now as the breeze carried it across the square. Sparks leapt from his anvil, scattering like fireflies before fading into the air. Carpenters displayed wooden stools, barrels, and tools with fresh pride, knocking gently upon their wares to show their sturdiness. Potters, their hands still stained with clay, laid out jugs, bowls, and pitchers, their earthy colors warmed by the afternoon sun. Each piece caught the eye differently now, the light shifting upon the smooth curves, the breeze stirring faint traces of the kiln still clinging to the clay. The animals too became part of this renewed energy. Horses stamped more briskly, their manes lifted by the wind, their snorts loud and impatient. Goats tugged at their ropes, bleating sharply, eager for feed or freedom. A pair of oxen bellowed, their heavy heads swinging, the sound carrying far across the square. It was as if the trade winds themselves had reached into every corner of the market, stirring not only people but creatures alike, quickening the pulse of all. And through it all, music rose once again. The fiddler, who had rested at noon, now played with sharper strokes, his bow leaping more energetically across the strings. The piper joined him, his notes carrying farther now, lifted and stretched by the breeze. Even a drummer joined, tapping a steady beat upon a small skin drum, giving the music a pulse that matched the movement of feet upon the cobblestones. Some villagers clapped in rhythm, their palms sharp against the hum of the crowd. Others, emboldened, began to step lightly into dance, nothing grand, only small sways and turns, yet enough to mark the shift from stillness to motion, from lull to life. The afternoon trade winds did more than stir the market, they carried whispers too. Rumors moved more swiftly in this hour, slipping between stalls, passed from mouth to mouth. Tales of bandits upon the roads, of new taxes demanded by distant lords, of marriages arranged and feuds reignited, each story floated upon the air, gathering speed as it traveled, gaining new colors with each retelling. For some, these whispers were warning, for others, they were entertainment, woven into the rhythm of trade like another kind of currency. The church bell tolled once, a slow note rolling across the rooftops, marking the hour's steady passing. Shadows began to lengthen, stretching eastward, softening the harshness of the sun. The square shimmered with this change, the afternoon light gilding the stalls, deepening the colors of cloth, of fruit, of wood and clay. Every object seemed touched with richness, as though the trade winds carried not only breath but light itself, painting the world anew. And yet, amid all this liveliness, there were still moments of calm. An old woman sat quietly upon a stool, her basket at her feet, her eyes half closed as the breeze lifted the edges of her shawl. A shepherd leaned against the oak tree, his staff resting in the crook of his arm, his flock grazing idly nearby. Even within the pulse of trade, stillness could be found, as though the wind itself carried not only motion but rest, a reminder that both belonged to the afternoon's rhythm. The market lived fully in this hour, vibrant yet balanced, stirred yet steady. The afternoon trade winds had transformed it, filling every corner with motion, sound, scent, and light, weaving together buyers and sellers, villagers and visitors, humans and animals, into one great tapestry of life. It was the market at its most alive, not in the rush of morning or the stillness of noon, but here, in the gentle sway of afternoon, when the world itself seemed to breathe in harmony with the breeze. And as the wind curled its way through the alleys and stalls, as it lifted the laughter of children and the songs of musicians, as it stirred the smells of roasting meat and freshly cut hay, it whispered a promise that the day was not yet done, that the market still had more to give, that the rhythm would carry on until the sun slipped behind the hills and the world tilted into dusk. The shadows of evening. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon, and with it the entire village market seemed to shift its tone once again. The bright vigor of the afternoon softened, stretched, and began to give way to something quieter, gentler, more thoughtful. The day was far from finished, yet the faintest whispers of evening were already drifting across the square. The light changed first. The golden blaze of afternoon mellowed into a softer amber, spilling across rooftops and cobblestones like warm honey. Stalls that had glowed brightly in midday sun now seemed bathed in a subtler, more forgiving radiance. Fabrics took on deeper hues, their colors saturated as the low sun caressed them. The smooth surfaces of pottery gleamed with long, slanting highlights. Even the dust that rose from footsteps seemed transformed into a golden mist, catching the last bright rays as though the air itself had turned to treasure. Shadows lengthened. They stretched across the square like slow, reaching fingers, joining together in corners, weaving between stalls, wrapping around carts and benches. Children who had played in the open sunshine found themselves suddenly darting between stripes of shadow, their laughter echoing differently now, softer. Almost as if hushed by the weight of dusk. Dogs slunk closer to their masters, curling in the shade of stalls. Horses stood still for long moments, their silhouettes tall and elegant against the glowing backdrop of the sky. The market itself responded to this change. Voices grew lower, less urgent, tinged with the knowledge that the day was winding down. The merchants no longer shouted so boldly but spoke with calm persistence, eager to sell what remained before the light slipped away. "One last measure of barley," a farmer would say, his tone almost gentle now, as though coaxing rather than commanding. "A final spool of wool, half price at day's end," murmured a cloth seller, his call softened, hopeful but resigned. The rhythm of commerce slowed, but it did not cease. It shifted, like a river turning toward its mouth, calmer, wider, deeper. And with the fading of urgency came the rising of reflection. Buyers lingered longer at stalls, not simply to haggle but to talk, to share words with their neighbors before they returned to distant homes. Conversations lengthened, hands lingered upon counters, and laughter came not from quick amusement but from shared stories, from recollections of past markets, from promises to meet again. The market was no longer a place of frantic trade but of communion, of togetherness, as though the very falling of the sun had drawn people closer. The smells changed too. The heavy scent of roasting meat that had filled the noon air softened as fires burned lower. The smoke drifted in thinner veils, carrying with it only faint hints of spice and fat. Bread that had been baked at dawn was now cool, its aroma fading, replaced instead by the sweeter smell of honey and cider that sellers poured into cups to warm the cooling evening. Somewhere, a pot of stew still bubbled over a small flame, its scent rich but muted, a lingering comfort rather than a bold invitation. The breeze shifted as well. What had been the trade winds of afternoon, brisk and lively, now softened into a cooler flow, drifting across the market with a sigh. It lifted shawls from shoulders, it ruffled hair, it stirred the edges of tablecloths. With it came a faint chill, not unwelcome but undeniable, reminding all present that the warmth of day was slipping quietly into memory. And as the wind moved through the square, it carried with it a new sound, the toll of the church bell in the distance, marking the hour, deep and resonant, rolling through the valley like a voice older than the village itself. The animals, too, seemed to sense the change. The oxen shifted heavily, their massive forms casting long shadows across the ground. Chickens, restless through the day, now began to settle, clucking softly as they found perches and corners where they could roost. Dogs, once darting between stalls in search of scraps, now circled their chosen spots and lay down, curling into the first drowsiness of evening. Even the birds overhead flew lower, their wings catching the amber light as they wheeled toward the woods and hedges beyond the fields. The music of the market softened. The fiddler bow no longer danced with midday vigor but instead drew longer, slower notes, their tones plaintive, reflective, almost wistful. The piper's melody floated gently, a thin ribbon of sound barely rising above the hum of voices. The drummer, once insistent, now tapped only sparingly, as if each beat were a measured heartbeat of the fading day. The tunes were not mournful but serene, a lullaby for the market itself, easing it slowly toward rest. Children's games ended reluctantly, as parents gathered them with calls and gestures. Some resisted, still chasing one another between the last stalls, but even their energy waned, replaced by yawns and heavy steps. A girl clutched a wooden doll close to her chest as her mother lifted her into her arms. A boy dragged a spinning top by its string, the toy no longer twirling but bumping along the cobblestones as his father guided him toward the edge of the square. Slowly, steadily, the crowd thinned, though never all at once, like waves receding, leaving traces of foam behind. Merchants began to pack away what remained. Clothes were folded carefully, bolts stacked and tied. Crates were lifted into carts, baskets emptied and overturned. Stalls that had brimmed with abundance now showed bare boards, their surfaces worn smooth by countless market days. The sound of wooden shutters closing echoed faintly as chests were locked, lids fastened, goods secured against the night. Each motion carried with it not only the weight of labor but the rhythm of routine, for this was how markets had ended for centuries, gradually, steadily, under the watching eyes of the setting sun. But not everything is closed. Certain stalls lingered, those selling ale, those offering hot stew, those where villagers gathered less for goods than for company. Around these, people clustered in small groups, their conversations weaving into the lengthening shadows. Jokes were told, old songs remembered, tales of saints and ancestors recounted in quiet tones. Here, laughter rose softly, like sparks from dying embers, glowing briefly against the dusk before fading once more. The air grew cooler, the breeze more insistent, carrying now the earthy scent of fields beyond the village. It mingled with the smoke of hearth fires beginning to rise from cottages, drifting in faint blue threads toward the darkening sky. Above the rooftops, the first star appeared, a tiny silver glimmer against the deepening blue. Eyes lifted toward it, some with silent prayers, others with absent wonder, as the day folded itself gently into evening. And then came the shadows in full. Not only the long stripes cast by sun and stall, but the true gathering of dusk itself, the slow filling of space with gray and purple, the blurring of edges, the softening of colors. The market seemed cloaked now, as though a veil had been drawn over it. Faces glowed faintly in the last firelight, outlines blurred, movements slowed. The noise dwindled to a murmur, the square hushed beneath the weight of night's approach. Yet there was peace in this. The villagers did not fear the shadows, they embraced them as part of the rhythm of their days. The market did not mourn the fading of light, it rested, knowing that dawn would come again, bringing fresh life, fresh goods, fresh laughter. The shadows of evening were not an end but a gentle pause, a reminder that all things must ebb before they flow once more. The final sounds of the day rose quietly. The creak of cart wheels as the last merchants departed, the clink of coins counted carefully by candlelight, the soft call of a mother guiding her children home. From the church, another bell tolled, slower this time, its deep notes echoing through the valley as though bidding the market good night. The square, which had been a whirl of color and noise, of scent and life, now settled into stillness, into silence, into shadow. And so the day slipped away, leaving behind not emptiness but memory, the memory of trade and laughter, of bargains struck and stories told, of music carried upon the wind, of scents that lingered in the air. The shadows of evening were not heavy, but soft, a blanket laid gently across the village, tucking the market in until morning. The people departed, the animals stilled, the fires burned low, and above it all, the sky deepened into a sea of stars. The market slept, as did the village, wrapped in quiet, in peace, in the timeless rhythm of night. Chapter 8, Night Falls on the Square. Night descended not with haste but with grace, as if it too wished to honor the market day with a quiet farewell. The last light of the sun lingered faintly along the horizon, a pale line of gold slowly melting into violet, and then into a deep, enveloping blue. Above the rooftops, the first true stars had already revealed themselves, timid at first, like small sparks peeking through fabric, before growing bolder, clearer, until the whole sky shimmered with distant silver. The world that had been alive with noise and color only hours ago now lay beneath the soft cloak of darkness. The market square, so loud and bustling through the morning, so alive with rhythm at noon, and so glowing in the mellow light of evening, now began its final transformation. Shadows no longer stretched, they merged. Where once shapes and figures had been distinct, the night now smoothed every edge, blurring stalls and carts into a gentle tapestry of silhouettes. The cobblestones glimmered faintly where the last lanterns swung, their flickering flames painting small islands of gold upon the ground, around which people passed slowly, their faces illuminated for only a moment before vanishing back into the night. The sounds changed most of all. The chatter of trade had faded into silence. The calls of merchants had grown quiet hours ago, and now only the low murmur of lingering voices remained. A pair of farmers spoke softly as they loaded their final baskets into a cart. A merchant counted his remaining coins by the dim glow of a candle stub, each metallic clink muffled against the wood. In the distance, a door shut, then another, each echo a gentle punctuation against the silence. And then, as though on cue, the church bell tolled again, its deep voice rolling slowly across the village, summoning hearts not to business but to rest. Lanterns burned lower. Oil sputtered in their basins, casting uneven light upon the square. Where flames failed, the moon rose to take their place. Full and round, it drifted high into the night sky, spilling its silvery glow across rooftops and cobbles, filling the market with a softer, more ethereal illumination. The stalls, half empty and half packed, gleamed faintly as though draped in moonlight cloth. The air itself seemed hushed, touched by something sacred in the union of silence and light. The sense of the day had mostly vanished. Gone was the thick smoke of roasting meat, gone the sweetness of fresh bread, gone even the sharp tang of herbs. What lingered now were quieter, subtler fragrances, the faint must of wool, the earthy smell of emptied baskets, the lingering trace of cider spilled into the dust. From nearby cottages, the richer sense of supper drifted through the cool air, stew simmering on a hearth, onions softening in fat, bread warmed once more for the evening meal. These mingled with the night's natural perfume, the smell of damp soil, the faint sweetness of wildflowers closing their petals, the crisp clarity of the cooling wind. Animals settled into their nighttime rhythms. Horses stamped hooves softly as they were tethered near barns, their breath rising like clouds into the cool air. Chickens had long since roosted, their clucks replaced by the gentle rustle of feathers in sleep. Dogs padded quietly after their masters, curling beside doors or near fires. Cats, unseen during the chaos of the day, now emerged, prowling silently between stalls, their eyes glowing in the moonlight as they hunted the scraps and mice left behind. Even the insects joined the nocturnal chorus, their chirps and drones weaving a steady lullaby for the slumbering square. And then, gradually, even these sounds softened. The last carts rumbled away, their wheels groaning faintly over uneven stones before fading into the distance. The last conversations dwindled as families stepped through doorways, their figures swallowed by lamplight before the doors closed with gentle finality. Shutters creaked shut, one by one, until the windows that had glowed with warm firelight became darkened eyes staring out into the night. The market square, once the pulsing heart of the village, now stood quiet, still, waiting. Yet it was not empty. The market at night possessed its own life, its own presence, quieter but no less real. The stalls stood like silent sentinels, their wooden frames creaking softly in the night breeze. The cobblestones seemed to exhale, relieved of the pounding footsteps that had pressed upon them all day. The well in the center of the square reflected the moon, its still waters like a mirror holding the sky. And the air itself held memory, the laughter, the songs, the bargains, the scents, all lingering invisibly, woven into the very fabric of the night. A lone fiddler lingered longer than most. He sat upon a low wall at the edge of the square, his bow moving lazily across the strings. The tune was slow, wistful, almost like a lullaby, each note rising softly into the cool air before dissolving into silence. He played not for coin now, nor for the audience, but for himself, for the peace of closing the day with song. When he stopped, he laid his fiddle gently into its case, stood, and walked quietly into the darkness, leaving only the echo of his melody behind. The moon climbed higher. Stars multiplied overhead, their brilliance sharpened by the cool clarity of the air. Constellations stretched across the heavens, patterns the villagers knew well, symbols of gods and heroes, of beasts and seasons, of stories told at firesides to children before sleep. Perhaps, in that moment, a child lying awake in a cottage bed gazed out of a small window at the same sky, listening faintly to the last echoes of the market, and dreamed of the day just past. The silence deepened until it was almost tangible, a presence that wrapped itself gently around the village. Yet in that silence was no emptiness, no loneliness. It was the silence of rest, of completion, of a day well lived. The market slept, as did the villagers, as did the animals, as did the very earth itself beneath the stars. And in that sleep lay promise. For though the stalls were bare tonight, they would brim with goods once more. Though the square was silent, it would echo with voices and laughter again. Though the fires burned low, they would blaze anew with morning kindling. The market was eternal in its rhythm, opening with dawn, swelling with day, quieting with dusk, sleeping with night. The villagers, like their ancestors before them, and like their descendants yet to come, trusted in that rhythm, in the simple, sacred cycle of daily life. At last, the church bell tolled once more, a final call across the valley. Its deep, solemn voice marked the arrival of true night, its echoes carrying far beyond the village walls, across fields and woods, into the dark beyond. The sound lingered, then faded, leaving only the chorus of crickets, the whisper of wind through thatched roofs, the occasional bark of a dog. The world was at rest. And so the day ended. The market square, now bathed in moonlight and silence, held the memory of life within its stones. The voices of morning, the laughter of children, the music of noon, the shadows of evening all lived within it still, tucked gently into the folds of night. Tomorrow, life will return, bright and full once more. But tonight, the square belonged to quiet, to darkness, to dreams. Sleep descended as softly as the shadows had, wrapping the village in its embrace. Families rested, children dreamed, merchants slumbered, animals stilled. The market square itself seemed to dream, holding within it the hum of the day like a lullaby echoing faintly against the stars. And if you listened closely, very closely, you could almost hear the memory of footsteps on cobblestone, of music on the breeze, of laughter mingling with the sense of bread and spice. The echoes of the market day whispered still, carried by the cool night air, reminding all who slept nearby that life was steady, enduring, beautiful in its rhythm. Night had fallen on the square. The world was at peace. The story of the market, of the village, of the day, had closed until the sun would rise again, and life would awaken once more.